Welcome everyone to the Environment Forum sponsored by the Mahindra Humanities Center and to the third event in the inaugural year of the forum. You know, I was thinking, this is the first one that I've introduced, and I was thinking about it and I realized that rituals are important, this ritual invocation at the beginning. They give meaning to human choices, they structure our sense of the way things work, and their power is often overlooked in these modern worlds that we inhabit. But I'm grateful for them today, here in the forum, because the rituals of events such as this one require recognitions of debt and gratitude, gifts, really. And I'm especially grateful to a number of people who have made this series possible. It makes sense to begin our time this evening with recognition of those gifts, and in my eyes, they're substantial. And so I'm pleased to thank my co-convener for the forum, Kelsey, the always inspiring Dean of Humanities and Arts here at Harvard, and also to thank a remarkable group of interlocutors, provocateurs, and organizers led by Homi Baba at the Mahindra Center. Homi, Steve Beal, and Sarah Razor in particular have made this forum possible, and I wanted to thank them for bringing us together. Of course, rituals do more than give meaning to gifts. At times, they intervene to orient us when we're most at sea, lost in swirls of elation, grief, confusion, or fear. And so it's appropriate that I invoke ritual protocols today, perhaps spurred most broadly by the deluge of very real news surging out of Washington, D.C., notably from the Environmental Protection Agency most recently, and inspired more immediately by what must be one of the most provocatively titled presentations given at Harvard in recent times, Professor Roy Scranton's Arctic Ghosts, Ecocruising the Death Spiral. I can't wait to eco-cruise the death spiral. I only just met Roy this afternoon, and I hope you'll forgive me for the informality of using your first name. I use it because, like many here, I imagine, I feel that in some sense I've known you for some time. Roy's authorial voice is unmistakable in its eloquence and insight, and in its staunch refusal to remain quiet in the face of what must be the most disorienting and damaging aspects of this contemporary culture of ours, war and climate change. You see, Professor Scranton is an Army veteran as well as an English professor, and he brings both of those skills to bear in his work in a variety of fascinating ways. Most notably, Roy's 2013 opinion piece in the New York Times, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, stands as one of the most powerful statements of these times. Eventually expanded into a slim but weighty book, for my reading, a manifesto really. Published by City Lights Press in 2015, the work has joined After Nature, written by the previous presenter in the Environment Forum, Jedediah Purdy, and perhaps The Collapse of Western Civilization by Harvard's own Naomi Oreskes, and of course the work of the inimitable Dipesh Chakrabarty. It joins those works as a grim but entirely necessary prompt to thought. A bit of intellectual trouble that won't leave us, something so difficult that we find it challenging to even think. What does it mean to live in the age of the human, or the Anthropocene? What are the ethical, cultural, political, and personal stakes of the recognition that the future, to paraphrase the title of another book, is not what it used to be? That human beings, rather than impersonal geological or other natural forces, have altered the trajectory of world history, natural history really, such that we can no longer assume a linear trajectory from past to present to future. The stuff that my discipline, history, is based upon. None of us chose this, Roy points out in another piece in the Times, and he continues, none of us can choose to avoid it either. We can, however, choose to struggle on, even in the face of such real news, real facts. And that struggle is one of the reasons for this forum. Roy's contribution to our thinking on these matters, and in particular the culture of the Anthropocene, are many and ample, but to me it's his personal voice that cuts through the din of panic and discombobulation and data. That voice is audible in an impressive range of work encompassing pieces in The Nation, as well as the New York Times, of course, and Rolling Stone, as well as his recently published novel, War Porn, and a set of finely done peer-reviewed academic articles. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome that voice into our forum this evening. Please join me in welcoming Roy Scranton.
Thanks. So thank you, Ian, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Ian, and Robin Kelsey, and Homi, Baba, and the Mahindra Center for having me here. It's a real delight to speak with you here tonight. And of course, thank you all for coming. I'll just begin. At the top of the world, a great wheel is spinning. Circling the Arctic Ocean, a current called the Beaufort Gyre drives pack ice clockwise around the pole. It pulls warm Pacific currents through the Bering Strait north and west above Siberia, pushes into the East Siberian Sea and the Transpolar Drift, then rolls away from Russia and whips south against Greenland and the archipelagic frontier forming the rocky, distant rim of the Canadian Shield. As winter descends and the seas freeze, the gyre drives newly formed ice against the land-fast flow edging those northmost coasts, thickening the ice in ridges and layers, and bit by bit forces drift ice into the straits that form the Northwest Passage. As winter thaws to summer, the pack ice breaks up into the Chukchi Sea, where warm Pacific waters join the gyre as it turns again in its grinding cycle. The pack ice that the gyre drives around the top of the world breathes with the seasons, expanding in winter, contracting in summer, regular as a heartbeat. Over the past 30 years, though, the total amount has shrunk. Minimum summer sea ice area has decreased by more than half, as has estimated summer sea ice thickness. Even more alarming, total summer sea ice volume is almost a quarter of what it was a generation ago. Think of how an ice cube melts in 3 dimensions. Scientists at the Polar Science Center and the National Snow and Ice Data Center expect summer sea ice could disappear entirely as early as 2030. Some people are calling this dramatic decline the Arctic death spiral. It will mean the end of the Arctic as we know it. The Beaufort Gyre is just one wheel in a vast convolution of interconnected wheels that make up the global climate system, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, the Gulf Stream, the carbon cycle, and many, many more. As one wheel speeds up, slows down, changes, disappears, it affects all the others, feeding back into the system. The Arctic death spiral will work like that. As white ice melts into dark water, it will diminish the Earth's ability to reflect light and heat back into space, thus increasing overall warming. Carbon and methane, frozen in Arctic permafrost, will thaw and flow into the atmosphere, intensifying greenhouse gas effects and increasing overall warming. Deep ocean circulation, which depends on differences in temperature and salinity to move water around the world, will slow and shut down, radically changing regional climates, contributing to sea level rise and increasing overall warming. To see the Arctic death spiral firsthand, and to see the Arctic before it melted, I took a 17-day adventure cruise with the outdoor expedition company Adventure Canada into the Northwest Passage 2015. Ian Tamlyn, folk singer, Adventure Canada resource staff. The one thing that I will say is that my stories are anecdotal. I'm not a scientist. I'm a musician. I've seen these things. I've seen the Northwest Passage change in my lifetime. But there's no substance to what I say. I'm just a storyteller. What it is, if it's not scientific evidence, is bearing witness. I've seen it happen. Cedar Swan, Adventure Canada CEO. On my first trip, when I was 14, we were cruising in a little fjord just south of Kangerlussuaq. We came right up to the foot of a glacier, and we were zodiacking there, and it was amazing, and everything was wonderful. Then I went back to that exact same glacier in 2007, and there was nothing but rocks. Tagak Curley, Inuk hunter, former Canadian legislator, co-founder of the state of Nunavut, Adventure Canada resource staff. I can confirm that the seasons have changed. We had colder weather when we were kids. The freezing and snow would normally come a lot earlier, even the first week in September. And now, mostly, almost about a month later, we start seeing freezing on the lakes. In terms of the sea, it's dangerous in some parts to travel on the sea ice in October, even November. If that were 40, 50 years ago, the base would be solid and the flow edge would be a few miles from the shoreline. Our journey began in the Alpine Room of the Sheraton Gateway Hotel Toronto. Enthusiastic Adventure Canada staff in migraine blue shirts with polar bear logos went over the basic outlines of our cruise. A total of 191 fellow adventurers listened politely, a crowd of mostly white, mostly silver-haired retired couples in various stages of physical decline, with a few singletons and only a smattering of younger blood. I counted a half dozen under 50, including myself. The plan was to sail north up the west coast of Greenland, go west into Canada through Lancaster Sound, then sail north around Victoria Island, and down through the Prince of Wales Strait to Kugluktuk, although our final route would depend on the sea ice. Along the way, we'd clamber into black-hulled Zodiac boats for a series of landings and excursions. It was hammered home to us that this wasn't just a cruise, but an expedition, and that we had to be ready for anything. From Toronto, we flew to Kangerlussuaq, where we boarded the MS Ocean Endeavour, a 450-foot converted ferry built in Poland, Ice Class 1B, first registered as the Konstantin Simonov in Russia, now owned by the ship management company FleetPro, based in Switzerland. The weather in Kangerlussuaq was auspicious, warm and clear, with temperatures in the 40s and 50s Fahrenheit, where they would remain for the entire cruise. We steamed that night into a refulgent midnight sunset, magenta and coral clouds glowing over the craggy, nice walls of the fjord, and in the morning woke at Sisimiut, a Greenland fishing village comprising many small, brightly colored square houses like Legos scattered in the sun. The ship spent the day taking on supplies while we wandered around town. A shop sold gleaming silver sealskin gloves and wiry balls of muskox yarn. Sled dogs yipped and howled from their yards. The next day, we anchored at Ilulissat, 171 miles further north, another town of bright square houses and home to a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Ilulissat Ice Fjord, a 30-mile-long channel choked with giant icebergs carved from one of the world's most swiftly collapsing glaciers. The Jakobshavn Glacier has been melting back at a consistent rate of more than 100 feet a day, dumping more than 38 billion tons of frozen water into the sea each year. In the days before we arrived, a nearly 5-mile square chunk fell off the face, what some observers think might have been the largest single calving ever seen from that glacier. The iceberg-choked fjord that the glacier emptied into seemed unreal, like a breathtaking modernist abstraction in white and blue and silver, 3D, vivid, luminous, massive and grave. Jakobshavn is responsible for about 10% of all the icebergs that Greenland produces. From Ilulissat, they follow the current north along the coast to Cap York, where they turn and wheel back south along Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland, slowly melting their way into the North Atlantic. Leaving Ilulissat, we sailed with them, stopping along the way for picturesque hikes at Karat Fjord and Kalorsuaq Island. From Cap York, we diverged from the current and sailed north out of Baffin Bay to the most northerly point we would reach, just a smidge beyond 78 degrees. A thin, shining line of pack ice cutting across the gray water of Smith Sound and cloaked in a low fog blocked us from going any farther. We didn't know it at the time, but this would be the only significant sea ice that we would witness. That day, August 26th, we zodiaced in down a long, spectacular fjord to land at Etah, a lush glacial valley rich with tundra, mosses, grass, and wildlife. We saw birds, musk oxen, and Arctic hares. But the most striking sign of life was in the innumerable bones littering the valley floor. A great cairn of them had been heaped up on the beach near a couple of Inuit hunting shacks, testifying to Etah's plenty. Caribou antlers and muskox hooves, walrus skulls, and seal spines. A mile or so back from the cairn was the glacier face, gently sloping to the moraine at its base. Gently sloping to the moraine at its base, the glacier poured a stream of water out into a large pond. Its north edge had melted back in a curious way, creating a passage and, within, a small cave leading back under the ice. Standing inside the glacier, you could watch the vast Greenland ice sheet melting right before your eyes. You could feel it, slick, cold, and glistening under your hand. You could hear it drip, drop by drop, into pools among the rocks. Greenland is losing about 300 billion tons of ice every year. Over time, that ice is going to raise sea levels by more than 20 feet. Drip by drip, drop by drop. Bernadette Dean, Inuk hunter, seamstress, advocate of Inuit culture and language, member of the Nunavut Water Board, Adventure Canada resource staff. I've lived in the North all my life. It's my home. The last few years, we've had cold winters, but 10 or 12 years ago, we started noticing the freeze-up was later and later. And in lots of cases, it was dangerous for hunters traveling on the sea ice. Another thing I've noticed is the change in the wind patterns. Easterly wind is more common now than it used to be, and the molting season of the seal seems to be a lot longer. Dr. Mark Mallory, seabird biologist, Canada Research Chair in Coastal Wetland Ecosystems, Acadia University, Adventure Canada resource staff. Moving north, climate change hits you like a tidal wave. All the scientists, that was their focus. All the talk amongst Inuit communities and community members was about how things had changed. In 1999, we were told that the typical temperatures we could expect in the summer might be 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. By the time we left Nunavut in 2012, it was very common to have at least 1 week in Iqaluit over 20 degrees, 24 to 25 degrees on some days. Chris Dolder, Adventure Canada Assistant Expedition Leader. We were going out into Smith Sound and we're trying to traverse eastward to get to Etah, and we found ourselves going alongside a tabular berg. We steamed over 2 hours down one face of this berg, well over 22 nautical miles. One face. This is the first time that we'd encountered something that large. Why is that? Because the ice shelves at the top of Ellesmere Island are breaking apart. Ecotourism, adventure tourism, expedition tourism, call it what you will, wilderness-oriented group tours remain an ethically dubious proposition. Built on and often glorifying a tradition of brutal, racialized colonial domination, adventure tourism restages the white supremacist conquest of nature and natives as a carefully controlled consumer encounter with pristine wilderness and indigenous cultures. And while it's nowhere near as violent as the heritage it celebrates, it cannot help but change the places and the people it objectifies as experiences in ways both obvious and subtle. Adventure Canada CEO Swan, along with nearly every staff member I spoke with and several of my fellow passengers, expressed an alert and sometimes pained awareness of the problem. In this case, a history of environmental and cultural exploitation stretching from the fur trade and whaling days to more recent Canadian efforts to forcibly assimilate Inuit. Lecture programming on the Endeavour focused heavily not only on environmental issues and climate change, but also on Inuit culture and history. Two esteemed Inuit leaders, Bernadette Dean and Tagak Curley, were on the cruise's resource staff, in addition to a biologist, a zoologist, a botanist, an archaeologist, a geologist, and a historian. Generally speaking, the hope was that the experience would make passengers more conscious of the very history of despoliation it reprised, and that the positive increase in social awareness thus achieved would outweigh any negative impacts, not the least of which came from the Ocean Endeavour burning 10 to 20 tons of fuel every day. For us, as a company, Swan told me, I feel that there's value in bringing people to a place that brings them so far out of their regular life that it gives them a little jolt. To say, hey, it's not all pavement and Walmarts and provincial parks, to have that wake-up call to remind us that we're a very small part of a much larger picture. Swan introduced me to her resource staff, with whom I had many long conversations. I talked with biologist James Halfpenny about polar bears and sea ice. I talked with zoologist Rebrin in Houston about environmental education. And I talked with Tugok Curley, one of the founders of Nunavut, about Inuit perspectives on climate change. Their voices resonated through our journey like a chorus. One of the most interesting people I spoke with was Ian Tamlyn, a sandpaper-voiced folk singer who'd been coming to the Arctic for decades. When I asked him about climate change, his merry eyes grew somber and their charming twinkle dimmed. I think about it all the time, he said. There's a song of mine called Listen to the Waterfall, and it's about that. I wrote it at Ilulissat, one day out there in a Zodiac. Just the water that was pouring down off those glaciers and icebergs, and I just went, wow. To me, it's the slow disaster. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And it's a disaster. It will eclipse everything. James Halfpenny. Once we lose the multi-year ice, that's a major tipping point. And I think we're probably going to see an ice-free North Pole in 5, maybe 15 years. Brennan Houston. We need to look at what's coming at us with our eyes open. The Arctic will be ice-free. The Arctic ecosystem will change. Grise Fjord, Canada's northernmost community, is a small village of about 150 people, mostly Inuit, and 2 Royal Canadian mounted police officers who rotate through every couple of years. Perched on a desolate, rocky stretch of Ellesmere Island, the village was founded in 1953 through a Canadian government resettlement scheme to assert national sovereignty in the far north. Inuit from Quebec province were promised land, support, and good hunting, then shipped hundreds of miles above the Arctic Circle and more or less abandoned. They were isolated by sea ice, visited by a government ship once a year, and spurned by the local RCMP. Informed on their arrival that hunting in the region was severely restricted because of recent wildlife protections, the resettled Inuit struggled for years to survive in near-starvation conditions, coping with neglect, malnutrition, depression, and suicide. In recent decades, after the founding of the Inuit-governed territory of Nunavut, the settlers and their descendants were offered the chance to return to the south. Many took it. The ones who remained proudly called Grise Fjord home. Our cultural expedition there started with a visit from Grise Fjord's elders to the Ocean Endeavour. They sat awkwardly on stage in the Nautilus Lounge while Cedar's 2-year-old daughter danced around them. There were some speeches, then a Q&A session. Among questions about native dress, seal hunts, how much food costs in the north, and the effects of technology on kids today, one passenger asked, "Is the weather changing in Grise Fjord?" This seemed apt. The Inuit name for the town, Ajuituk, means place that never thaws, but the bay we'd anchored in was mostly clear, save for a few icebergs in the distance and a chunk of ice melting in the shallows. John Houston, a bushy-browed, bearded filmmaker and culturalist on staff with Adventure Canada who'd grown up in the north and lived among Inuit all his life, translated the question into Inuktitut. One of the female elders took the microphone and spoke, then John translated back. Yes, she's really seen those changes. One of them is the loss of snow. Another is warmer air. The ice is melting much more quickly. The shore-fast ice vanishes in the spring almost overnight. And there are many more changes, many changes. There are a lot of signs of climate change here. Then Larry Adlauluk, one of the senior elders, stood up and took the mic from Houston. He spoke in English. I want to dispel a notion about polar bears, he said. I hear a lot about polar bears, a lot about what people down south think about polar bears. And I want to tell you that polar bears are very healthy. There are very many polar bears, far too many of them. The ice hasn't affected our polar bears. The polar bear is just fine. I was perplexed. Why was he talking about polar bears in response to a question about climate change? And were polar bears threatened? In the Canadian Arctic, it turns out, polar bears are political. The fundamental conflict is between international environmental concerns and local economics. On one side, scientists and environmentalists argue that the polar bear is endangered by climate change, specifically by the loss of sea ice. The United States has declared the bear threatened and has lobbied to ban international trade in their pelts. On the other side, Inuit in Canada depend on bears as one of the few sources of cash in what is mainly a subsistence economy. As Houston explained to me, there isn't that much cash income for senior hunters since Greenpeace and friends basically gutted the fur trade. The real cash income for a senior hunter would be to guide a non-resident sport polar bear hunt, the purse for which can be $20,000 or more. In many cases, it would be, by far, the majority of their annual cash income. In addition to the purse, a single pelt can sell for up to $10,000 Canadian. Complicating the polar bear question are two factors. First, while scientists do have a strong case for describing what's going on with polar bear populations, they don't have very strong data to back that case up. Andrew DeRocher, a biologist at the University of Alberta and the author of Polar Bears, A Complete Guide to Their Biology and Behavior, told me that the bears are a highly specialized apex predator dependent on sea ice ecosystems for their main prey, ringed seals. Less ice means fewer bears. We expect to lose about 2/3 of the polar bear population by mid-century, he said. Yet he also told me that current estimates of the polar bear population, the global polar bear population, around 20,000 to 25,000, have a margin of error of plus or minus 40%, meaning that the range could be anywhere from 12,000 to 35,000. Data on the bears is spotty, out of date, and hard to gather. Inuit call the polar bear pihokahiak, the ever-wandering one, characterizing nomadic tendencies that, for biologists, make the bear difficult and expensive to study. The simple fact is that if we want to know what's going on with polar bears, we need more science. The second factor complicating the polar bear question is that Inuit and outfitters from Labrador to Cambridge Bay have reported seeing more bears today than in the past. Tagak Curley told me, "We know for a fact from our forefathers, from the time we were little boys, that polar bears are increasing. I think you will see that anywhere. As my friend Mickey Tech Bruce said, Nanuit nungu jangit tualuit. Polar bears will never disappear." Even if DeRocher is correct in predicting that polar bears will be affected by loss of habitat, local observers may still be right. Polar bear populations have probably grown in recent decades after mid-century overhunting was curtailed in the 1970s. In addition, decreasing pack ice would likely send bears inland for food, where they'll run into more humans, thus giving the appearance of greater numbers. Whether polar bears were endangered or adapting, the stark poverty of Grise Fjord made a much more compelling case for polar bear economics than Larry Adlaulach had. The houses in town were bleak, the few residents we saw grim. A scowling grandma in a dirty jacket drove by in an ATV. Our tour guide, Rose, showed us the medical center, clean but sparse, and the co-op, a dusty, blighted general store, restocked by ship each September. The prices were 2 to 3 times what you'd pay in Toronto or New York. Most people, Rose told us, relied on country food like seal, muskox, and whale. We were taken to see a statue of a stout Inuk woman glaring at the sea, the official memorial honoring the sacrifice the Inuit had made to Canadian national sovereignty. We were brought into the town's cultural center and given samples of raw Arctic char and beluga blubber, offered crude sealskin handicrafts and photographs of the memorial for purchase, and shown a performance of Inuit throat singing in traditional dress. 2 of my fellow passengers told me how much they admired the Inuit for not being resentful and angry like some other indigenous peoples were. One of our other tour guides showed us his bear pelt. It was his second kill, he said. He'd shot the bear himself from about 10 feet away. He was 16 years old. The bear's thick white fur was rough to the touch. It was the same bear that appeared on the Adventure Canada logo, the same bear that's become an icon for climate change activists, the same bear that's used to sell Coca-Cola. Who had the right to decide what this bear's life meant? Who was entitled to say what it was worth? John Huston. When you talk about time, often our people, white people, have tried to present themselves in a patient, tolerant, long-suffering, forbearing sort of way. And the expression that sums it up that I've been hearing ever since I was a kid was, well, of course, it takes time. It's a very tricky and complicated phrase when the colonizers sigh to each other and say, it takes time. What do they mean? Well, it takes time to eradicate the native in the person, doesn't it? That would take time. Ian Tamlyn. I've argued for Inuit rights and claims. The injustices done to them in our First Nations have been horrendous. It's a really embarrassing part of Canada's history. But whether the future of those rights is a right or a romantic notion, I don't know. Sometimes I think the Inuit people see our presence in the Arctic as transitional, that one day we won't be here. I don't know if that will ever be the case. Bernadette Dean. People need to understand the true facts, and they need to change their attitude. Whatever attitudes they may have about Aboriginal peoples everywhere, and incorporate Aboriginal values. When you come from a place like this, and you've lived here all your life, and you know the seasons, and you follow the plants, and you follow what the land is doing, and then you get researchers who come up here for 2 or 3 months of the year, and they're acknowledged experts. All those people, when it comes to October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, they're not going to be up here. I'll be here. Tagak will be here. Sir John Franklin's 1845 expedition to find the Northwest Passage was manned by adventurers who lived the motto of Enlightenment philosophy, sapere aude, dare to know. Like us, they'd believed that with technology, ingenuity, and daring, they could master the unknown. Franklin's ships, the HMS Terror and Erebus, were outfitted with all the latest cutting-edge equipment, including steam engines, reinforced hulls, and 3 years' worth of canned goods. They were crewed by brave, resilient, and skilled sailors. They were commanded by veterans of the Napoleonic War with years of experience in the Arctic. Somewhere in those frigid northern waters, though, the ships caught fast in the ice. As the stout-hearted crew succumbed to starvation, hypothermia, and disease, they turned on each other, descending into madness and cannibalism. Franklin's expedition ended in disaster. Franklin's arrogance may have been partly to blame, as well as his cultivated ignorance of Inuit knowledge, but the real culprit, as Owen Betty established conclusively in 1984, was the lead used to seal the canned food that Franklin had brought to ward off scurvy. Beatty and his team proved this by performing autopsies on 3 sailors Franklin had buried: able seaman John Hartnell, Royal Marine William Brain, and Petty Officer John Torrington. The men's bodies lay interred on Beachy Island, a small bare rock rising up out of Perry Channel. Today, as more and more cruise ships and private yachts ply the Northwest Passage, Beachy Island has become an important tourist stop. Indeed, when we arrived there on the morning of August 30th, we found a 170-foot custom-built Bonetti yacht named Latitude in the harbor, with a covered runabout tethered beside. By the time our 5th Zodiac had unloaded for the day's expedition, rumors were flying that Leonardo DiCaprio was on board. After all, he'd been spotted camping on Baffin Island in July and had been in Canada recently filming The Revenant. Our ship's videographer thought he'd spotted Michael Fassbender as well. Later that morning, after most of us had already done our sightseeing and returned to the ship, a polar bear ambled up out of the water onto the beach. It was the 4th bear we'd seen. Those of us already returned massed on the sun decks at the rear of the Endeavour, snapping photos, while Zodiac swiftly ferried back everyone still on the island. Meanwhile, the Latitude's runabout broke away and motored in toward shore, coming to rest about 100 yards from the bear. The bear watched the runabout closely. We watched the bear. Then, after several minutes, the bear suddenly looked up, startled, and fled. Photographs and video showed a drone flying from the runabout and buzzing the bear. Assistant Expedition Leader Chris Dolder vowed to report the incident to Canadian authorities. That night, compounding the excitement about Beachy Island, the bear, Leo, and the drone, we were led in a rousing rendition of Stan Rogers' Canadian anthem, Northwest Passage, treated to a special Franklin Expedition-themed dinner, and invited to dress up in costume for an explorer-themed dance party. The mood was high, charged with a peculiar mix of compulsory fun, emotional release, and cultural pride. When the Franklin expedition failed to return to England in the late 1840s, the British Navy and Lady Jane Franklin funded numerous search and rescue attempts. The rescue expedition led by Dr. John Ray was the most successful in terms of actual information, but also the most controversial. Ray brought back reports from the Inuit that the Franklin expedition had degenerated into cannibalism. The news was a scandal, and Ray was attacked in the press by Charles Dickens. The controversy ended Ray's career. One of my fellow passengers, a retired microbiologist from Los Angeles, was dismissive of Franklin's allure. "What's the big deal?" she asked. "He fucked up and died. End of story." Maybe it was the sense of mystery, I offered, the fact that they never found his ships, or at least not until recently. She was skeptical. And as I looked around the dance party at all the pale, pink-cheeked Canadians dressed like Vikings and British explorers, it occurred to me that she was right. It wasn't mystery. It wasn't even sapere aude. What the Franklin expedition glorified was the war of man, white men, against nature. Franklin was indeed a tragic figure, and the tragic flaw he embodied was a will to power that knew no bounds. He was doomed because nature proved finally unconquerable, but in honoring his memory, we were celebrating and carrying on the war he'd waged. As the MS Ocean Endeavour burned another 15 tons of carbon, sailing blithely through placid, warming seas, Franklin's war against nature was being replayed by retirees dancing to ABBA in Viking helmets, confirming Marx's well-known observation that history repeats itself the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Ian Tamlyn. We live in different times at different times. The arguments that Tagak and Bernadette are making are in a different time frame than the time frame we live in. What they're arguing is really good, but there's another wheel that's turning. The effect of European trampling is not over. Heather McGregor, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Ottawa, author of Inuit Education and Schools in the Eastern Arctic, and fellow adventurer. If climate change demands of every human on this earth that we put aside some of our national affiliations and look at this as something that we need to tackle transnationally, beyond the borders that have made sense to us up until now, I'm still not sure that we can do that without recognizing the history of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. If there's going to be climate change cooperation, it needs to be done within the context of the call for decolonization. Stefan Kindberg, expedition leader, Adventure Canada. It's all over the Arctic. It's not only this part. It's the Russian Arctic, it's the Scandinavian Arctic, it's the Arctic everywhere. The idea of the North has long been a whirl around a void, a dreamland, a question to be answered. As Margaret Atwood writes, popular lore established early that the North was uncanny, awe-inspiring in an almost religious way, hostile to white men, but alluring, that it would lead you on and do you in, that it would drive you crazy, and, finally, would claim you for its own. This conception of the Arctic brings with it a sexual politics, a racial politics, and a geopolitics, all of them calling for assertions of white male mastery. From the search for the Northwest Passage, to claims for Canadian sovereignty, to the idiotic death chant, "Drill, baby, drill." Yet for thousands of years before Franklin tried to pierce the Northwest Passage in 1845, humans eking out a tenuous existence there knew very well what the North was made of. It was giant bones and kalupalik, Angakuit who could turn from animals to men and back again, a near-knit that were sometimes wind and sometimes women, sometimes waves and sometimes seals. Their world was neither Edenic nor sublime, but fraught with constant danger from bone-cracking ice, ravenous bears, and innumerable unseen spirits. The greatest peril in life lies in the fact that human food consists entirely of souls. An Inuk named Ivaluarjuk told Danish anthropologist Knud Rasmussen a century ago. All the creatures that we have to kill and eat, all those that we have to strike down and destroy to make clothes for ourselves, have souls like we have, souls that do not perish with the body, and which must therefore be propitiated, lest they should revenge themselves upon us. Those nomadic Arctic hunting cultures have been destroyed by colonialism, by modernity, by industrialization, as completely as were those of the great Iroquois nations and the Nambikuara of Brazil. We no longer live in the world of Ivadluarjuk, in which humans must battle and propitiate invisible spirits. But we no longer live in the world of Franklin either, in which the white man is locked in an unending war with nature. The Enlightenment hero's idea of the North, that conception of the Arctic as a sublime encounter with pristine wilderness, was being destroyed by the very ship I sailed on and the very passengers I traveled with. We live today in a world in which we've been struck low, perhaps lower than ever before, unwitting agents of our own demise, unable to control the immense technologies we so arrogantly believed were ours, incapable of exerting the rational collective will necessary to save civilization from destruction. We find ourselves reduced to something less than human, lacking even the dumb instinct for survival we see in plants bending toward the sun. Geologists, scientists, and other thinkers have advanced the idea that the Earth has entered a new epoch, one characterized by the advent of the human species as a geological force. They're calling this epoch the Anthropocene. Some thinkers suppose this idea implies that we have advanced beyond nature, that the world is now completely human. But while they grasp the truth that we've left the Enlightenment's division between man and nature behind, they've grasped that truth by the wrong end. The Anthropocene implies not the supersession of nature by human civilization, but the opposite, the reduction of human civilization to the status of a fossil. On a geological timescale, we're just another rock. As the Endeavour sailed south from Beechy Island, I sat with Ian Tamlyn over a glass of Chardonnay, watching the sun drop into a black and iceless sea. When Students on Ice started, their motto was "Save the Pole, Save the Planet," he recollected. In recent years, that logo's disappeared, in part because of the reality of the situation. It's heartbreaking for me because these kids really want to save the planet. They're totally dedicated to it. But a few years ago, one of Stephen Harper's ministers came on the trip, and he told the students that global warming should be seen as an economic opportunity. I don't understand why they did that, but at the same time, that's a reality. It's a reality that our prime minister sees, and a reality that others see as well. What do we do? Do we try to save a planet that can't be saved, or do we adapt? I've got a generation of kids who are still living in a paradigm of saving the planet. Others see that we're beyond that and that it cannot be saved. So a Machiavellian politician will say, let's look for opportunity where we can. Let's look for the rare metals under the glaciers. Let's open the Northwest Passage. Again, going back to my lifetime, I've seen that transition of going from a pre-climate change world to a climate change world to a post-climate change world. We're acting it out. But I've never actually been allowed to say these things. It's not part of the party line. Brennan Houston. I do hear people say, well, what's the point? What's the point? It'll make the Earth completely uninhabitable for life as we know it. Bacteria and whatever will survive, but I care about life as we know it. We need to be fighting all we can to decrease greenhouse gases. James Halfpenny. To be honest, the North is doomed. The Inuit way of life is gone. They can't go out on the ice to hunt. It won't be long before it's only annual ice, and I suspect there may be a time when there's no ice. There just ain't a rosy picture there. Tagak Curley. Maybe it's like the elders say, Ajut Narmat, nothing to be done. The first cruise ship to transit the Northwest Passage, the MS Lindbad Explorer did so in 1984. In 2015, 6 other cruise ships made the passage with the Ocean Endeavor, plus at least 7 private yachts, 2 cargo ships, and a tanker. 2016 saw as many, plus the MS Crystal Serenity, an 820-foot-long luxury liner that carried more than 1,000 passengers on a 32-day cruise from Seward, Alaska to New York City. As the Ocean Endeavor sailed west through Coronation Gulf toward our final destination in Kugluktuk, I was overtaken by the realization that what I'd come to see was already gone. The Arctic was changing in response to global warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. And by the time I'd gotten there, it had already been through the hottest years and the most precipitous declines in sea ice ever recorded. The 5 record lows for sea ice extent had all occurred in the past 8 years. 2015 saw the lowest recorded seasonal maximum in February, bottoming out at bottomed out at 1.7 million square miles on September 11th, until that year's record low for sea ice maximum was shattered again in 2016, as the planet warmed beyond anything humans have ever seen. Yet, if it is true, as the Buddhists teach, that nothing is ever what it is for very long, then perhaps it is also true that nothing is ever wholly lost. Things morph from one form to another as energy and matter coalesce and transition back and forth from waves to beings. Any truly empirical view of life must admit that the universe is flux, time change, and death nothing more than a shift between states. As the Earth's gyres and flows wheel and pass, diminish and crescendo, there is no final end, no doom, no death spiral, since as each wheel turns another and turns into another, every end is a new beginning. Passengers board and disembark. Ships sail east and west. Planes fly in and out of Iqaluit, Sydney, Beijing, JFK. Traffic thickens and thins along the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. The lights along Manhattan turn on, as the fossil-fueled grid ebbs and surges. The stock market rises and falls, days turn into weeks, weeks turn into years, money changes hands, and carbon flows from under the earth into the sky. Ice melts into the sea, drop by drop. Another UN convention meets. Another election cycle begins. Another hottest summer ever passes. As we stood in our life jackets below decks that last day, waiting to Zodiac ashore for our flight to Edmonton, we were met by passengers coming aboard for the next cruise, out of the Northwest Passage, 2015. Another crowd of silver-haired adventurers, our group's uncanny twins, smiling in confusion as we cheered them on. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy, for that evocative, provocative talk and for ushering us into the death spiral. What I want to do, I have questions, of course, but I'd like to hold them a little bit and see what comes from those who have joined us this evening. We'll open the floor to questions and comments. I'll field them and let things unfold a little bit. Let me open the floor. There will be a microphone on its way to Risa.
I'm a visual artist, and my work deals with climate change. And in 2015, I was also in the Arctic, but in Svalbard, on a small sailing vessel with other artists and writers. And we didn't see as many polar bears as you did, but it looked very similar to the pictures that you showed. Often the question I get, a lot of my work is based with plastics. I use plastics in my work. And the question I always get often is, how do you square with using plastic in your work? And there's no easy answer for that. Except that I look around and all of us are using plastic all the time, and we just have to look at our clothing and everything we use. And you brought up the whole point about the fuel that the boat was using, and I think that's a really good point. Like, why bother going if you care about the environment? Should you go on a trip like that? And I was just wondering how you deal with that question, and if you think about that.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, as I sort of tried to address to some, I mean, much of that piece is about being complicit and being unable to escape that complicity, and particularly from the sort of I don't know, it's sort of like climate change journalism or climate change witnessing, like witnessing point of view. Like, it seems there's no way to go to the Arctic or there's no way to witness what's happening with climate change without admitting and talking about one's complicity in it. And that actually, it seems to me, that points to a sort of deeper problem with thinking about climate change, which is the problem of talking about it talking about it and figuring out what to do with this whole moral side of it, right? Because, you know, the fact of the matter is, like, it doesn't matter what any one of us do, right? It doesn't really matter. And I argue it seems to me, and I argue in my book Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, that we're sort of over the cliff anyway. You know, and so the question of who's to blame that has an easy answer in a certain way, but it doesn't seem very helpful for dealing with the situation. Like, we need to address that. We need to talk about that, but in another sense, so it needs to be part of how we're thinking about it. But then there's another way in which, you know, we need to go beyond that step, right? And just address what's happening.
Thank you, Roy. Homie.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much. Really very evocative and, but also a little puzzling. I quite see the posture of witnessing, and I think this is a very fine, you know, you witnessed a number of things, including self-ironically the people who were with you and who were coming on again, and the witness of the dying polar bear was, you know, extraordinarily moving, particularly the image, you know, bathed in blood, and then the kind of other touristic beckonings amongst a population that is so endangered and dying. So I like that. But, you know, you talked about you described the situation as one of colonization, oppression it clearly is, commodification in a different way. But in all those conditions, generally, in witnessing those conditions, there's always been some sense of agency, utopian or otherwise, that people who've witnessed pull out of it. You know, there's some possible horizon of agency, and that's what I missed in a way. And of course, thinking of the Gaias, you know, reminded me of the Yeats poem, which and that was evocative. And even there is a sense that, you know, once the spiral, once it really tightens, there's some way to come out of it. And I couldn't find that in what you spoke at all. I didn't know where this sort of collective agency, which you've just referred to, where you said, you know, individually we can't do anything, but maybe we should. So I didn't get a sense of agency other than the doomed agency. And of course, you know, I mean, I don't underestimate dying at all in this sense in which you talk about it, but I think it's a powerful and evocative ethical problem, you know.
Right.
But there, yeah, I just couldn't get it. I couldn't get where the kind of, even the bud of agency was here.
Well, I would say that, good. In a sense, then I think the piece is successful because it's, I don't know where that agency is, right? Agency is one of the really, the deepest, right, sort of philosophical problems that we confront in thinking about climate change and thinking about the Anthropocene, and thinking about how we're warming up the planet through through processes, right? Through the agency of, and this comes into arguments about terms, Capitalocene or Anthropocene or what have you. Where's the agency? Is it capitalism? Is it humans? Is it British industrialists? Is it ExxonMobil? And this sort of refers back to the question of where we want to attribute causality, where we want to attribute responsibility. And that's all well and good to think in those terms, but I think also thinking in those terms implies already a subscription to a kind of agency that, just as you say, can get us out of it, right? That can solve it. A kind of agency that might yet have the power to liberate us from our determination by nature. And that's the kind of agency I think is put into deep question by the very idea of the Anthropocene, and it's something I'm very skeptical about.
No, you represent me as wanting to get us, not at all, just to be able to actually take some responsibility for what we do and think about it systemically. So it's not a question of, it's not a sort of self-indulgent, rising out of the situation. Mm. It's how to actually, do what you're trying to say, which is in some ways we've got to save this. We've not got to let it get worse. It can hardly be that by getting worse, for it getting worse in some ways, there will be a kind of revolutionary betterment about it. So I don't think it's getting out of it, but how to confront it. That's what you're doing in the conversation, in the talk.
So Larry Buell would like to express his agency and intervene. Yeah.
This is partly the confessions of a silver-haired decrepit who's logged too many nautical miles on eco-cruises of such like kind, fancying himself to be doing it in the name of environmental humanities too at times, but never mind that. To me, the fascinating thing about agency in this narrative is that it's located in the perpetrators of the cruise ship itself. Those that are orchestrating the program and of such like entrepreneurships that, as you say, have been in the increase since the 1980s. This is a case to attach a phrase to it. You alluded to the effect yourself of opportunistic adaptationism. This is to quote a Norwegian scholar in a similar but somewhat different context. And in the circumpolar nations, there's a lot of that that kind of agential force being unleashed. And we who, and again, I have had similar kinds of adventures too. I'm not meaning to sound righteous about this. We who partake in them are giving ourselves over for the nonce to these agents of opportunistic adaptationism. And it's instructive, it's eye-opening, but we are as passengers and observers and narrators, pro tem, rather forfeiting, it seems to me, our agency for the sake of whatever takeaway value of the eye-opening sort the cruise gives us. And you've certainly demonstrated a lot of the eye-opening takeaway in the process of your narrative. But the agential force is there. It's the cruise lines.
Yeah, okay.
Would you like to respond, Roy? We have a couple of questions lined up. So.
We'll come back to the question of agency, perhaps. It's a big one. So, but we can have more.
So we'll come back over to the middle here, but we'll start up on the left.
Hi, thanks for your talk. That was very interesting. A few years ago, I took a boat in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh strikes me as more of a death zone than the Canadian Arctic. And what you were saying about Stephen Harper's people, you know, the Canadian government, who are essentially big oil lobbyists, they're saying this is going to be good for Canada. And in some ways, this is entirely true. And it's probably even true for the native people of the Arctic. And this gets into what you pointed out, which is a real difficult question, which is what do you do with countries like Canada and Russia, who are massive fossil fuel producers, but have a lot to gain from, in a sense, some places are going to gain from this, at least in the short term. So what do we make of that?
What do we make of that? Well, I mean, indeed, so there will be, I mean, climate change is change, right? And change is opportunity, and people will take advantage of that opportunity. It's, I think we're all doomed, but some people will be, ride out the changes, ride out the catastrophe of global warming, right, in more luxury or in more security. I mean, that seems a given to me. I mean, so what do we make of that? I mean, I can't offer I don't know that I can offer a convincing accounting of evil in the world, but it exists, and people will do it, and prey on each other. That's going to keep happening, just like it's happening today, and just like it's built, the American empire. So in that way, in that way, maybe this, addresses the question of agency again. But in that way, climate change isn't offering us, in that sense at least, I think, something new. It's just sort of turning up the volume on aspects of humanity that already exist.
So I have two folks in the middle. We'll come to Robin, and then we'll move up here along the aisle. And then if there's not another, please signal me if you have a question. Otherwise, I have my own queries I'd like to interject too.
Thanks so much for this. I was struck by the fact that you began with a discussion of climate science. And then throughout the talk, there was this mosaic of anecdotes and local observations and intergenerational dialogue, which in some sense went against the grain as a matter of social form with respect to the climate science, and brought out a certain affective dimension to living in a state of human-induced climate change. And I just wonder what thoughts you have with respect to these affective dimensions, and say the dimension of grief, for example. If in some sense we're bracketing agency because it seems so vexed or doomed, in what ways does the affective then rise up as a domain of particular interest or consequence?
Thanks. Yeah, so that goes to the heart. That question goes to the heart of some of the concerns I talk about more explicitly in learning to die, which is, and particularly the question of grief, which is the idea of sitting with and thinking about and confronting not in an agonistic way, but really letting it confront us, right? The mortality implicit in our own lives, the mortality that climate change offers to our way of life, right? The idea of death that is locked within every moment, and the idea of human suffering and evil and our complicity in that, right? That climate change is that's precisely what it's going to turn up. It is turning up, right? And I think, this is part of our lives and going to become increasingly a larger part of our lives, and it's a part of the lives of, it's inherent in the lives of every human, and different people experience it differently. But taking the time with that mortality, with that fear, with that grief, with those difficult, unpleasant emotions that remind us that our investments in what happens next week or next year are impermanent and transient and contingent, I think can open up a deeper sense of our connection to each other, a deeper sense of our connection to the natural world, a deeper sense of our dependence on each other and on the world we live in. So it's sort of, and part of the way, to do that, I think, there's a meditative aspect to it or a philosophical aspect to it, I think. But I think part of it might also be in that affective realm and bringing that out and, working through, witnessing, sitting with these questions of conflicting agency and grief and loss, and just letting that happen. I think it opens up the present.
Thank you. So we'll come up here, and then we have two questions over to the side here.
I did hear you with a very strong moral theme throughout this that we haven't talked about. It's a theme of agency. Carbon fuels and rising population are clearly taking the planet somewhere that we can't control, that no agency perhaps can control. But we can have control over how we deal with each other. And your discussion of frequently mentioning the Canadian government's treatment of its native peoples and so on, the fact that there is built into this winners and losers, it seems to be a very important piece of agency in all this. It may not be the agency that will end this and solve it, but it is an agency of being human.
Yeah, I think that's that question again of winners and losers. I think one of the things that climate change and the Anthropocene does is it throws us back on a sense of morality and ethics in a world of limitations, right? If we're in a kind of Malthusian world right? Where there's no utopian potential to fix everything or to redistribute everything or to somehow make everything okay for all humans everywhere. If that's just off the table because resources are going to decrease and more people are going to die and so on and so on. If that utopian progressive potential is just off the table, like what does it mean for our ethics? What does it mean for our morality? What does it mean for our politics, for how we relate to each other, especially, when we live in nations and governments where the state seems to have little accountability to the people. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge issue, and I think I think part of what we need to do there is explicitly to turn from whatever kinds of questions of how do we stop it, or even how do we mitigate? I hope and pray and applaud scientists and inventors and even corporations, right? People who are trying to come up with ways to mitigate climate change. But I think there's an important way in which that's not gonna answer the exact questions you're talking about, right? Like we need to think about how we exist together in a world where there's no easy answer to the problems of being human.
That is a difficult question. So we'll come here in the blue, and then just in front.
This isn't really a question, but a comment, I guess. So one of the things I like the most about your piece is the way formally you have these voices and your sort of narrative through line, but you allow them to be like a chorus, you said. And one of those voices talks about living in times within times and these different time scales, which you also sort of talk about in, is the Anthropocene about the end? Is it the revelation of our civilization as a fossil? Is it a projection forward, backwards? Like, where do we stand in time? It seems to me that this is related to what you were just talking about, and also to this ongoing question of agency, which is central, I think, to what you're doing. And there is your piece just formally sort of demonstrates the ways in which agency can operate at different levels potentially at once, that there can be a sort of central narrative, ethical decision maker, but there can also be these other voices in conversation, constellated with each other. So I find that very powerful and evocative. And in your article version of Learning to Die, you talk about, before going out to run these missions when you were in Iraq, just kind of sitting, basically what you were just talking about, thinking about all the ways you could die, and then going out, and how spending that time allowed you to then make sure that other people weren't going to die. And I think that again, that sort of relational quality, like what would that look like at a civilizational level? And it probably can't happen at a civilizational level. So how does it work in terms of other collectives, other forms of collaboration or community? Anyway, that's just a comment.
Thank you.
So actually the next question is just in the row right in front of you. Anne-Sophie, if you...
Actually, it was a pretty similar question. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate your exploration of the concept of death at the physical level, but also at the spiritual level, and then connecting it to some practices in Tibetan Buddhism. And then in your book, you also take it to the civilizational level, as my colleague just mentioned. But I was my question is about the connection between all these levels where that is present, and how do you conceptualize like the that in terms of your personal meditation practice, and how do you like bring it to a more cultural or civilizational level? Because I think that in your book we can see agency emerging from the concept of the death of our civilization. So here that is taken more in a metaphorical sense and beyond, you know, the physical death of the bodies.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And the flip answer would be, of course, I just turn on the news. That's, I mean, that's, and I just can observe. But I mean, in a more serious way, it's in a more serious way, as I argue in the book, it's a process of, I think, you know, you could call it a spiritual process, you could call it an intellectual process, you could call it or a practice, you know, you could call it a philosophical practice, and it has to do with the kind of work that we might do as artists or humanities scholars or writers or thinkers to accentuate and ponder and work to attend to the transience of the way that we live, right? Our entire life world, right? And you know, one can do that in comparatist ways, or in other kinds of practice. I mean, that's a harder question. It's like, how do we actually manifest that kind of attention? But I think it's something that humans have been doing for a long time, but that has become, in certain ways, occluded within modernity, right? Where death is always put off, right? Where the transience of things is put off, where the transience of things is only important insofar as things are like folded into new forms and new markets, right? And new ways of the new, right? So yeah, so there's a lot of, I don't know, you know, I think thinking with a deep sense of history and trying to let in these other voices, and I don't know, there's a variety of ways to go about it. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So actually, I think that gets to some of the historian in me thinks the world's been ending for a long time, and I think I wanted to push at that idea a little bit and talk about the techniques that you bring to bear in particular. Mm-hmm. So uncanny, ghostly, a surreal explorer's ball, as I remarked to my neighbor, you know, I hope there was no lead in the diet at that ball. It would, to be historically accurate, it would have had to have it there. Witness, and so on. That the lines between fact and fiction run back and forth in your stuff. That is, you work, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, you work in both modes. And I wanted to ask you about, in particular, pushing at this question of agency, or perhaps agency is too agentive, it's too active. There's a Buddhist aspect to some of your stuff that is initially what drew me to it, the invocation of the Hagakure, which is the way of the samurai is in death, which sounds quite grim, but is actually an act of radical acceptance and being in the world that one must inhabit and does inhabit. It is very present-oriented. And so I wanted to ask about your approach to the nonfiction work and your approach to fiction, which deals with many of these same issues, certainly conflict, death, violence, which runs through your stuff as well. And are these different tools, do they lead you to different conclusions? Do they help you to reach a different place, a different kind of sitting or acceptance, to use the Zen that elicited the Hagakure statement, for example? I'm not talking about confronting fake news with real news and deploying facts, but I'm talking about the affective dimensions here, which I think is what you're leading us to. The field points us to agency. Mm-hmm. We talk about decline, we talk about progress, and we talk about contradiction. And Bill Cronin and others have helped us to look at those issues, along with Larry Buell and others. What about this other way of understanding things?
So I use many of the same sorts of tools in fiction or nonfiction, narrative and concepts and images and different, even bringing in different voices. There's a key difference in the sort of the contract one has with the reader. Obviously, in nonfiction, one is more accountable. But there's another difference, key difference as well, and this is a way in which I'm always actually trying to drag my nonfiction work, whether it's scholarship or journalism or what have you, more toward my fiction, which is that fiction, or at least in the novelistic way I think about it, is inherently polyvocalic, like polyphonic, right? I'm Bakhtinian in that way, right? Like heteroglossia is like wired into the form of the novel. It's because it just in its constitution, even in a certain sense, in its fictionness, right? There's already layers of distance and multiple voices, even if it's a fiction that is from a single point of view. There's already a multiple relationship between the author, the reader, and then whoever that protagonist is, right? Mm-hmm. And then whatever discourses or voices are involved there. And so there's a way in which, for me, fiction is from the beginning, choral, or it's a admixture of voices and discourses, and that's part of what it's working through, is how do we put together, how do we live with different perspectives and different understandings of agency and different kinds of self-narration and so on and so on. The different ethical claims, right? Competing ethical claims, and so on. Nonfiction begins, or at least, it feels like it always starts out from a more, you have to place the ego somewhere, right? You're there. There's somebody's talking, right? You're talking in nonfiction, even if there are scholarly apparatuses for the effacement of that, or even if there are journalistic apparatuses for the effacement of that. There's still a certain, persona, authorial persona that elides, right, some of the inherent polyvocality in just writing itself. So that's a different thing. I feel like with nonfiction, my eye, right, the eye has to be somewhere more legible to bring the reader through the work, even if it's effaced in a certain way. And yet, still want, as I just hopefully performed, I still want to drag that into, right, a kind of polyphony. I want to drag that into a space where the authorial voice is there, but not, and still guiding a reader, because it's hard, it's impossible not to, but giving the stage more and more to other voices.
So does that, so in moving away from agency then, does that, and forgive me for following up on my own question, but does that elicit a different ethics? That is, if I want to bracket agency and push at other aspects of the work, because I think that's one of, in the Anthropocene literature in general, there's a great deal of focus on agency. One of the contributions I see coming out of your stuff is that it, in a certain sense, it is concerned more with ethics and with a process of being in this moment. What it is philosophical in that regard. And so I'm curious, is the ethics and the ethical stakes, do you feel them or see them or reason them to be distinct in your fictional work versus the nonfiction? And does that have anything to contribute to this broader discussion that we're engaged in the forum, that is coming to terms with this moment and our role, as you put it so eloquently, as artists and humanists?
I guess I would, so again, on a certain level, you know, the contract with the reader is different, and of course, you know, there's the whole question of reception and like how these different modes of, these different practices are taken up within various kinds of cultural production that have that bring along their own ethical complexities. There's a certain, you know, sometimes there's a certain sense in that it feels as if fiction, just writing fiction at all, the ethical stakes are in a certain sense lower because no one takes it seriously, right? Contemporary fiction. It's, you know, I mean, there are ways in which it's understood to operate within certain cultural and ideological and economies, we can say, and then, you know, other kinds of economies as well. But it doesn't seem to me that anybody's looking to find a novel to tell them how to live today, right? Like, we're a long way from that kind of moment, which is fine. And yet, in another sense, that seems to demand that one take it even that much more seriously, because otherwise it's just a commodity, or it's just telling people what they want to hear. So there's that, and you know, in those terms of sort of production and markets and readership, the ethical demands on nonfiction are, you know, more explicit and more easily legible. One should not lie. One should not make up facts. But putting all that aside, I think there's a way in which it comes back again to the ethical, in another way, the ethical stakes are the same and extremely high, because it's about how we understand each other, how we relate to each other through language as these like transient, you know, buzzing, weird things we call consciousness in sociality, talking about whatever all this is that's happening to us, right? And so in that way, the ethical demands are the same and very high, which is to not force oneself on the reader or on the world, but to to engage in a kind of communication that works toward the greatest receptivity that you can hold in your head and heart, I guess. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I've taken the liberty of asking the last question. I hope that you will all join me in thanking Roy for a wonderful talk.